In 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia, moving on its second invasion of northern soil, was met by federal cavalry at the small crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The following 3 days, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, led 160,000 troops maneuvering over the rich Pennsylvania farmland, engaging in the deadliest conflict ever fought on American soil. In its aftermath, 7,100 lay dead, 27,000 wounded, 3,000 died later as a result of their wounds. The town and its surrounding areas were left in shambles. Over 130 years later, signs of the great struggle dominate the landscape at Gettysburg as a reminder of what took place here, as do the number of stories that touched the lives of so many at such tragic time in American history. In 19th century warfare, whoever secured the high ground commanded the battlefield. The tallest buildings in the area were commandeered as observation posts.
There were several buildings in the town that had cupolas on them. There was a college, seminary, the Catholic Church on High Street, the Christ Lutheran Church on Chambersburg Street, the courthouse, and those, including the Farnestock building, which was on Baltimore Street, those positions, because they were high, afforded lookouts to Union and Confederate soldiers. There's not much information on who used them. We all know that the seminary was probably used by Buford and some of the Union officers on the morning of July 1st. We know that because Lee made his headquarters in that area, that is a good possibility that he used it also, although I have never read an account where Lee was seen in the seminary cupola of the main edifice there. However, there is information that Lee did use the cupola at the main edifice at the college, at Pennsylvania College. That was a very large white cupola that stood north of town. There was nothing else in the area, not even trees, and it would have given Lee a very good look out toward the town. And possibly from there he could have seen Colts Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Little Round Top somewhat, but he would have had to get closer to do any real good, and that's why I think he would have used the seminary. Now the church steeples or cupolas, although in those days they didn't have steeples, they had cupolas. And in fact, which is an interesting little sidelight a lot of people don't know about, is that those buildings, even on churches, did not have crucifixes as they do today. That's a very modern application. In those days, they all had weather vanes because the crucifix was not used in church lore or mythology at that time as much as it is today. But anyway, these church steeples or cupolas were probably used at various times. We know, for instance, the Catholic Church had a visitor probably in the form of General Ewell. General Ewell also probably used the Farnestock building and even possibly the Christ Lutheran Church. General Early, whose brigades were in the area of the town and also out toward Colts Hill, probably at various times climbed to those high points to get a viewpoint. But again, to have any hard evidence, we have very little. One Union officer in the Catholic Church did mention that he said Ewell, but it's possible it was General Early who visited the church, climbed over the Union wounded, went up into the cupola of the Roman Catholic Church, St. Francis, and looked out during various times. We do have also some information that some of the townspeople and some of the other wounded soldiers in the town during, say, some particular activity like Longstreet's assault on July 3rd did climb up to get a better view of what was happening on the Union or Confederate line.
On the evening of July 1st, Confederate forces overtook Gettysburg as rigorous fighting between the rebels and Federal forces on Cemetery Hill battered the town. Battle damage from these duels still remains a part of the Gettysburg architecture.
Immediately after the battle, it was easy to see battle damage, especially on the surrounding farms around Gettysburg, such as the Shaffer Farm, Colts Hill Farm, and others. In the town itself, which suffered considerably from artillery fire and rifle fire, you could see gaping holes in buildings. You could see serious damage done to windows and doors and shutters and other wooden fences, other wooden partitions. Anything that a bullet could perforate was pretty prominent. However, as the weeks and months after the battle moved on and people got back to their normal lives, they began to correct a lot of these problems. So holes in buildings were covered over. Sometimes shutters or doors had to be replaced because they had holes in them. Although some became souvenirs and some became relics of the battle, such as the door at the Jenny Wade house. Some people allowed the bullet holes and the shell holes in a way to be outstanding. They wanted them to be seen. They were proud that they had made it through the battle. They'd suffered this, and yet they'd come out victorious. These were Union sympathizers. Some people in town used to say that anyone who covered over the shell damage, especially from the Confederate side, or the bullet damage, were Copperheads or Southern sympathizers. I don't believe that's totally true, but it's possible. They may not have wanted to have something that significant showing everyone where their sympathies lied, and these people had done this to the town. So if a Southern shell had made a hole in their building, they would not have been proud of that. On the other hand, many Union people were. So much so, in fact, that you will find today that there are places in town where a cannonball or an artillery projectile still remains in the building. Now, when people see these shells, many times they believe that's the way the shell looked when it hit the building. We know that's not true. When the shell hit the building, normally either went through, it exploded, or if it didn't lodge in the structure, it knocked a lot of brick, mortar, and or wood away from where the shell would have stuck and not exploded. So we believe that after this shell would hit, or this cannonball, many people would pick it off the ground or take another one like it, stick it into the hole as they made the repairs, and mortar around it, leaving a sort of a souvenir, a relic of the battle sticking out of the walls. But these are not the way they look, but it is possible that that is where the shell hit during the fight. The one that I know of that is, to me, the most interesting, other than naturally the one at the Colts Hill barn, which everyone is familiar with, because that was the only one in the Gettysburg area that has not been repaired. That barn looks today, the side of it just about the way it would have in 1863, right after the battles. For some reason, the farmer, Catherine Trossel, and her son chose not to repair it. We don't know why, but it's a nice memento of the battle. My favorite is in a house that stood north of Gettysburg on the Harrisburg Road. During the battle, it was owned by a family named Benner. And Benner was a farmer who chose to remain in his house or around his farm, even though the Confederates had taken over his place, not only as a staging area for an attack on Blucker's Hill, which is today known as Barlow's Knoll, but he also chose to stay as it became a field hospital for some of the Confederate Second Corps wounded. One of the most famous people brought to this house, or a soldier that we particularly know, was General Barlow himself, Francis Barlow. He was wounded severely and brought to the house and placed in an upstairs room. Now, during the fighting of the rest of the battle from July 1st, when he was wounded, to July 3rd, several artillery shells passed right through this building. And on 2 occasions, according to the diary of one soldier who was there, a captain from Ohio, this house caught fire. And had it not been for Mr. Josiah Benner, who remained behind, the house would have burned down. But he happened to be there, which is unusual. He put the fire out, and the soldiers who were in there who couldn't move were very thankful of this. Today, that shell, which is a shinkle shell, a 3-inch shinkle shell, protrudes outside the rear of this building and is visible. It's perfectly safe today. There's nothing, but it's one of the few that remains almost in the exact spot as it would have come through the building itself and stopped at the rear outer wall. It is quite a unique visual effect when you see it. The Shaffer Farm had the house and barn. The Shaffer's family owned the peach orchards, which which was right across the Emmitsburg Road. The Shaffer Farm was made of brick and was, at one time or another, on July 2nd in the late afternoon, held by the Union Army and then the Confederate Army. The Shaffer Farm, I'm sure, was hit over 100 times by shells, cannonballs, and bullets. And today, there is heavy damage on some parts of it. Most of the serious damage, I'm sure, would have been taken care of, erased years ago. But today, you still can see bullet holes in the shutters and the brick walls, which are quite prominent. And considering how few buildings really have this damage, it is unique to be able to see this. There are some others in town that have a little more damage, but they were used as sharpshooter position, such as the Stock House on Washington Street. It's a gray painted brick building which has, I'm sure, over 100 bullet holes in it. And it was probably used by sharpshooters, which were dueling with the Union sharpshooters on Cemetery Hill during the battle itself.
Among the battlefield's more interesting features are rock carvings etched in boulders by veterans of the battles during or after the fighting.
There are several rock carvings in the Gettysburg area that are quite interesting. The most unique, the earliest, and maybe not the most famous, is the carving out at the Wheatfield area on the old Weichert Farm, John Weichert Farm, which is along what today we call the Wheatfield Road. It's located just north of the Wheatfield Road, and that particular carving is on a round boulder. It has the initials of the soldier. It has the regiment and Pennsylvania Volunteers. So it would have DA 140 and PV. And if you go there today, you're probably looking at the earliest carving. Although we know that some soldiers' graves were marked with some types of stones probably laid on them, and even possibly some initials, that's the only documented evidence that we have of a soldier's grave being marked on a boulder. What happened was the young officer who was killed in the area of the Wheatfield in the 140th, David Atchison, was buried below this rock. Some soldier, either during the battle or most likely right after the battle, came by and carved into the rock his initials and his unit. And they're still visible today, although they're very much worn and they won't last forever because the diabase granite boulders do weather fairly rapidly, more so than most people think. That's the most famous. There are other carvings. We know that some of the carvings date to 1864, 65. Those are the ones done on Little Round Top. The carving for Strong Vincent's, the place where he was shot, is still visible, but just barely. There's also the place where General Weed was mortally wounded. That's located a little bit north of the Strong Vincent carving. Both of those carvings, we believe, were done between 63 and 64 because visitors in 64 and 65 did notice those and record them in their journals. Other rock carvings in the area are known. There's a mysterious one that's never been found of a flag, a Union flag that's been seen, but at one time or another, but no one knows the location anymore of an American flag. Someone may have carved it after the battle, most likely. There's also a carving that a Confederate soldier made in Coble, who's a North Carolina soldier near Spangler Spring. That particular rock the carving is very, very light, and most likely in a few years will be gone. He probably carved that during the battle, although some people believe he came back to visit Gettysburg and made the little incision in the rock later on. It appears to be something quite temporary, though it doesn't look like it's not a deep or heavy carving of his name and his regiment. That's quite interesting. We don't know when he did it. We know he was here. We know that he did fight in that area with his unit. There's even one, supposedly a fellow by the name of Ward, who I believe was an Alabama soldier. He left a carving in the records, but we've never been able to find it. I'm not sure where that is, but although people have looked for it.
Colts Hill, one of the least visited areas of the battlefield, was the site of some of the most intensive fighting on July 2nd and 3rd. Earthworks erected by Union troops for protection stand today, marking the position of some of the most fierce fighting.
Sometimes we use the word Colts Hill as a catch-all for the entire area, from Spangler Spring to the hill itself. It's not really the way it is. There is a ridge, or a series of ridges that runs from Colts Hill itself down towards Spangler's Spring area, which is near Rock Creek. This particular point in the line, which is about almost midway, maybe a little more toward the hill itself. Now, right at one point, there's several angles, 90-degree angles or almost 90-degree angles in this line of works. One of these, which I prefer to call the angle, or the angle at Colts Hill, there is a section of the ground that was almost in the direct center of the Confederate attack. The Confederates attacked and the Union attacked on July 2nd and 3rd. There was a lot of fighting on July 2nd and 3rd at the Battle of Colts Hill. In fact, probably over 8 or 9 hours altogether. At one point during the fighting, the Confederates broke through this area, and there were many casualties there because they were caught in a crossfire. There was fire coming at them from behind the breastworks and from both sides. And there was one part of the angle which many eyewitnesses remember as being covered with bodies. There was an area of about an acre or two just out between the angle and Rock Creek that supposedly were covered by several hundred bodies. And it was one of the only places on the battlefield where eyewitnesses said they saw bodies heaped together, which is really unusual. Even though you read about it, no, it's not true. It rarely happened. But at this particular point in the angle, there are places in the eyewitness accounts where bodies were literally on top of each other, and some right up against the works, on top of the works, and within a few feet of the works where they died fighting to get there. Just behind this area, into the Union lines, is a flat rock. Today there's a monument, a Pennsylvania monument that sits there. An eyewitness right after the battle who rode along there just a few days after the battle said he remembered seeing a body of a Union soldier torn apart, literally in pieces, lying on this flat rock. And among his effects, the soldier's effects, he found a photograph, a damaged photograph of probably the man's mother or spouse or child, and he kept it as a souvenir. The man who found it was a young 22-year-old man named J. Howard Word, who was a writer and later became a teacher and later a Union soldier. And he saw this sight, which was to him very gruesome and pathetic, that he never forgot. There is a large boulder below the summit of Colts Hill, and on the boulder itself is another smaller boulder, and that's just below the Union earthworks in Colts Hill. Now today there's the remains of the rock walls that were piled up by the Confederates for protection, because when they made their attacks on the Union lines, some of the Union soldiers got the aim on these fellows, and so they built up these little walls made of stone and used them for protection, and there are remains of one or two even today. This particular rock that we're talking about, this very large boulder, is famous for another reason, because one of the well-known artists who came to Gettysburg right after the battle sketched the rock, showing Confederates fighting around it. And it's very prominent on the hill because in 1863 there was not as many trees, so you would have been able to see it quite easily.
Major General Dan Sickles, considered by historians to be one of the most flamboyant figures at Gettysburg, used the Shaffer Farm as his headquarters. By moving his 3rd Corps without permission, Sickles endangered the entire Army of the Potomac by exposing his flanks to attack.
Now, Sickles' headquarters was under a very large old tree, and this tree still stands today. At one point in the battle, around 5:25, he says in his notebook, his journal, he says about 5:30, 5:25, he rode up to the little crest of a hill just to the west of the barn, of the Trossel barn, which was owned by the Trossel family. Catherine, I believe, and her son were running the farm at the time. Well, as he either moved back because of the artillery fire coming against the peach orchard and flying over the peach orchard in that direction of the Threshing Floor. Either he was moving away to get out of the danger of the cannon fire, or was riding up there. He was struck in the leg by a 12-pound projectile. We believe it was a solid shot. This crushed the bones in Sickles' leg. Immediately, he dismounted, was able to get help, and was moved over to the barn. He sat against the wall where a strap from his saddle was placed around the leg as a tourniquet. Now, in the records of the National Military Park, there's an old map drawn, and most likely with the help of Sickles, of a rock that was directly to the north of the Threshing barn. And this rock, with the measurements from the place he was wounded to the barn to the rock, the measurements are accurate. They're very specific, and I suppose, and anyone who would see it would suppose that that was done with the help of Sickles to show where he was taken. We know that one of the eyewitnesses says he was taken behind a large rock to protect him from artillery fire, and this rock certainly significant enough to be used as protection from artillery fire. He probably lay there for a while. What he tended to him, he was going into shock. An ambulance was called for. Luckily, one came very quickly. They loaded him onto the ambulance and took him off the field. His leg was later amputated in a farmhouse or a field hospital somewhere to the east, out toward the Baltimore Road, and then he spent the night along the Baltimore Road. The next morning, he was started on his way for Washington. When Sickles' leg was amputated, because instructions had been given to the medical personnel to save specimens of human bodies for a new museum that was had its beginnings in 1863 in Washington. It would become known as the Army Medical Museum. Today, it's part of the Walter Reed Hospital. It's a very famous museum, has just hundreds and hundreds and thousands of specimens that were collected on battlefields such as Gettysburg. During the battle, well, I should say not during the battle, right after the battle, some of the doctors began collecting specimens, but as you can see, the word must have been out because Sickles' leg was saved, we believe, in a barrel of whiskey, a small barrel of whiskey that the medical department would have carried around with them in their wagons. Eventually, when the flesh was boiled off or rotted off, the leg bones, the crushed leg bones, the leg bones that had been damaged by the cannonball, were preserved and placed on exhibit in the Medical Museum in Washington. There's an old story about how Sickles, years later, used to sometimes come in for a visit to look around, and he would stand there by the case looking at his leg bones. So that's an interesting story because Sickles was prominent in the battle. He was a friend of Lincoln's, and just a very eccentric, outspoken, dynamic personality of the Civil War period, and the fact that his leg bone and his leg amputated at Gettysburg gave him this immortal fame, in a sense, that I think is worth looking into or looking at. During the Battle of Gettysburg, there were well over 150 sites that were used to care for the wounded. Officially, there were probably about 100 hospitals taken over by brigade, division, or corps medical people to care for the almost 30,000 wounded. When the Confederates left Gettysburg, most of their hospitals were consolidated and taken over by the Union soldiers, Union Medical Department, and those soldiers were cared for because Lee left behind many, many of his wounded. The Union hospitals, as well as some Confederate hospitals, stayed open out in the field. These are at farms, south, east, north, and west of Gettysburg, and in the town itself, stayed open for several months. We know that some of them did not close until late August. The corps hospitals of the Union Army, after the town had been taken over by the Confederates on July 1st, were moved to the south and southeast of Gettysburg, usually 2 to 3 miles down the Baltimore Pike, and then spread out in farms and fields west and east of the Baltimore Pike. One of the most famous was the 5th Corps Hospital, which was located on the Thistle Farm. The Thistle Farm, at the time of the battle, had a barn on it, really quite a nice barn, that probably dated to the 1810 to 1820 period. The barn was used by the most serious cases of the Fifth Corps. In fact, some of the men that held Little Round Top, as well as some Confederates, occupied that barn. We know that some of the 83rd Pennsylvania, we know some of the 20th Maine, and others. In fact, one particular room in the barn was set aside for an officer from the 20th Maine named Billings, who went sort of crazy at the time because of his wounds and because of all the men he had lost, and he finally died. And ironically, his wife arrived the day after he died to come to help him. Anyway, that barn stood for many years, just until, or just a short time ago, as we speak. The barn no longer stands. It stood from, say, 1810, 1820 until about, I guess, 1990, 94, 95. Someone purchased the land, as what's happening to many of these field hospitals, and turned it into a golf course. At that time, the barn was destroyed, and today the photograph you see here and the remnants of that area is the last we'll ever see of it. And that's another historic site that's going by way of progress. The barn that you're looking at is probably one of the most famous, in my opinion, barns in the Gettysburg area. Probably built just before the Civil War, maybe 1840s, 1850s. It was wood and brick, and it had a partial stone foundation. It sat on the Jacob Schwartz farm. At the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Schwartz farm, which was along really Rock Creek and White Run, was just a mile or so from the Baltimore Turnpike. And this became the scene or the site of several hospitals that joined here. The most prominent was the Second Corps of the Union Army. Nearby, and including this part of this ground, was the Third Corps Hospital. And just a short distance away was the Fifth Corps Hospital. And the First Corps was out toward the Baltimore Pike. So this Second Corps Hospital on the Schwartz Farm became like the center of all of these field hospitals. It contained thousands of wounded. The Second Corps Hospital alone contained nearly 4,000 men. That was 3,000 Federals and 1,000 Confederates. The barn itself held many of the Confederates. We have many eyewitness accounts where this barn was filled to capacity by Confederate wounded. The operations, the amputations and other major operations were done on the threshing floor. And in these Pennsylvania bank barns, you notice on one side there's always a ramp that leads you up to the threshing floor. Below there, where the stalls, where the animals were, up on the threshing floor, sometimes the farmer kept wagons there or did his threshing as well as kept his hay and straw. On this particular floor, we know from eyewitnesses that the amputations and operations were done. One of the attendants there remembered that as the operations were done, the blood from the table where the operations were done, the blood and water would drip down off the sides and be washed off the sides by water, would seep through the heavy planks of the threshing floor and would drip down on the patients below in the bottom of the barn. So as you look at this barn, you'll notice that the condition is not in its best for this particular historic site. However, that's very common, and these barns are going quickly in the area. They're not feasible to keep up by many people. Many people who own these farms don't even use them anymore. The barns just sit there and go into disrepair, and yet some of these places held the most serious, most horribly mangled men of the Gettysburg battle. Now, to go back just a ways, we're to talk about the wounded in general. When the Battle of Gettysburg was over, we know that there were nearly 30,000 wounded in the vicinity of Gettysburg. We also know that the town itself had been captured by the Confederates, capturing most of the hospitals of the 1st and 11th Corps. Then later, the hospitals of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 11th, and 12th Corps hospitals were moved south of Gettysburg to the area we're in now. As an example, over in the direction I'm facing now and pointing to is the area of the 1st Corps around what's known as the White Church along the Baltimore Turnpike. Like just over here to my left front was an area that they held prisoners in. It was also a portion of the 1st Corps hospital. Back over here to my right and rear, all along in here, was the 2nd Corps hospital, which again had several positions. that they had to keep moving to. In this area is the 3rd Corps Hospital right across Rock Creek. And then back over here would be the 12th Corps, and over here in the direction of town, about half a mile from here, is the 11th Corps on the Spangler Farm. All of the farms in this area, including this one, the Jacob Schwartz Farm, which was about 300 acres, were taken over by Union medical people as hospital sites. And the area we're standing in now is probably the direct center of an area that cared for over 20,000 wounded after the Battle of Gettysburg. This area is in jeopardy. They are building golf courses, probably housing developments are coming soon. They're planning a very large mall, not even 500-600 yards from where I'm standing now, which is supposed to begin, if approved, in the next year. This area, in my opinion, is one of the most important at Gettysburg, because while the battle lasted 3 days, the hospital period lasted 4 months. And during that period of time, thousands of men suffered and died in these places. There are burial spots even today on this ground that probably were never located. It's also of interest that back in this area, there was at least 150 doctors caring for the wounded. There were at least 100 ambulances transporting wounded back and forth from the hospital or from the hospitals to the railroad depot where they could get transportation to the major cities. And in this area were where all of the volunteer nurses, the Sanitary Commission, and the Christian Commission did their work. The Sanitary and Christian Commission provided volunteers to assist the Union medical people. There were also Confederate medical people assigned to these Union hospitals. And there were at least, as I said before, 300 volunteer nurses, most of them women, and a good number of them men that came here to aid the wounded. So this site in American history is not equal by any other. There's no place anywhere where there's as much suffering anywhere in American history than this spot right where I'm standing. The graves of the Confederates and Union soldiers dotted the hillside here and back into the woods, into a cornfield that was over in the direction I'm pointing. This whole area is, to me, so fascinating because of the tremendous amount of suffering that went on here. For at least 2 weeks after the battle, the men lay out in the open with only a few surgeons. For instance, this hospital alone had nearly 4,000 wounded. 1,000 of them were Confederates who had been captured, many of them from the so-called Pickett's Charge. They lay out in the open, in the rains, then in the sun, in the cool nights and the hot days, without any covering. Many of them had suffered amputations. Many of them had suffered serious operations, but they were laying on the ground, sometimes in the muddy water that drained out of the barnyards, literally lying in the manure of the barnyards with no covering for their wounds. These men suffered so greatly that it is beyond the power of most people's minds and the power of most of their pens that they write with, and the power of their descriptive qualities to be able to reinforce. And I can't do it myself, except to tell you that these places deserve to be protected and deserve to be studied and visited. We're standing in an area that saw activity by thousands of wounded people around us, hundreds of attendants, hospital nurses, doctors, hospital guards, and all of them use this site for not only camping. They use the creek off to my right, which is called White Run, which is right near Rock Creek, which is up here, for bathing and for other purposes, gathering water for the horses, the ambulance attendants, anyone who was in this area. And again, we're right in the center of activity which would have encompassed several miles of territory covered by thousands of wounded and hundreds and even up to 1,000 or so medical attendants. But one of the interesting secrets of the Gettysburg area is where I'm standing now. This is an actual latrine, or a sink as they called them in those days, dug by medical orderlies or even prisoners of war to take care of the massive amount of waste produced by these thousands of patients and hundreds of attendants. Right along here, it stretches for at least 50 yards, is a remnant of that trench that they dug for latrine purposes. If you look off along it, you can see the berm. You notice that in certain areas the water was taken from the creek, which is just about 50 yards away. The water was then channeled through this trench system and then out the other side. The system's about 50 yards long. The berms are discernible on my right and left. At the time of the Civil War, these would have been much deeper, of course, and the waste from the people who used the latrines, and of course there would have been platforms built of wood along here where they could sit and use the latrines in comfort, but they were right along the creek here where then the creek washed away the waste products, and all that's left today is this, almost looks like a series of trenches or military trenches or breastworks, but in fact is the latrine for the Second Corps Hospital. The hospital, the first position of this hospital was off to my right along the creek, and later when it flooded and there were sections of it that were too damp and too moist for the comfort of the wounded, they moved it up to the high ground on my left. And then finally to the third position up near the Schwartz farmhouse, and then the clover field that we saw, which has a round top in the background. So I consider this a quite interesting little feat of engineering, using the natural flow of the water to clean out the waste of this large latrine. This could have accommodated at one time easily 30 or 40 people or more. This is the 156-acre farm owned by Elizabeth and George Spangler in 1863. We're standing just at the entrance to the farm. The roadway, or the little lane that led to the farm, which were used by the Union ambulances to bring in wounded, is over here to my right. Over here to my left, about a mile, is the cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery, and today the National Cemetery. So we're about a mile south of the cemetery. Also to my left is Powers Hill. Powers Hill was a Union artillery position, and in this area to my left was where many Confederate prisoners of war were held during the battle and right after the battle. So many of the Confederates that were captured were collected probably only about 100 yards to my left, and then from that point they were marched through Baltimore and then taken into various prison camps in the north. The farm we're presently standing on is quite historic. It was one of the closest to the Union lines of a major field hospital. When the battle of the first day was over, about 6 o'clock in the evening, the Confederates took over Gettysburg, captured Gettysburg, and captured all of the Union hospitals there, including the warehouses, the churches, the schools, the courthouse, and other buildings that were used by the wounded. So immediately the Medical Corps moved all of their people to the south, and they set up the hospitals of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 11th, 12th, 5th, and 6th hospitals. Most of those are located in front of me here to my right or south, a mile or 2 miles. This is the closest to the Union line. In fact, so close that on the 2nd and 3rd day, enemy shell fire, Confederate shell fire, fell within the perimeter here that we're standing in, all through the fields, around the barn, all up here on the fields and woods to my front. The barn itself is interesting. It is the original structure. To the left of it, the house and summer kitchen made of stone. In the summer kitchen, on July 3rd, late on the 3rd, maybe early into the 4th, General Lewis Armistead of the Confederate Army, who had been wounded in Pickett's charge, died as a prisoner of war here. The doctor said his wounds were slight, and what seemed to cause his injuries was just a general exhaustion of the man, who didn't seem to want to fight for his life and just died because of exhaustion and probably mental duress. He was in not as bad a shape as you suspect, even with 2 slight wounds. The lane that you see here, again, carried the ambulances from the schoolhouse road over here to my left, all the way across into the barn complex and house. Most of the wounded, of course, stayed outdoors in tents. And the barn itself was used by Confederate wounded prisoners and by the medical staff of the Union Army. In 1976, I lived about a half a mile from here on a farm called the Shaffer Farm, which had been used as an aid station for the wounded at Battle of Gettysburg. In fact, in that farm was it was the place where General Sickles was taken after his amputation. In those years, I used to wander back into this area and visit the sites of the 5th Corps, 2nd Corps, 3rd Corps, 1st Corps field hospitals. This particular site that we're in now, I discovered several graves, 6 or 8 graves, on this little hill near Rock Creek. I believe it's the only place in the Gettysburg area that you can still see original graves from the Battle of Gettysburg. In these places that don't look like they did 132 years ago, were men that were buried who died of wounds received in the Battle of Gettysburg. At one time, a friend of mine named Stanley Phillips from Maryland came down and said, well, why don't we check and see if these really are graves? They look like graves. He was familiar with seeing them in Virginia. He cleaned out several of them using his metal detector and did find some objects. In one of them, we found a button or two, and another a suspender buckle and a bullet and odds and ends like this. And in one of the graves, Stan Phillips found a couple of bone fragments, which we see here, one jawbone with even some teeth remaining, a bullet which appeared to have been fired, which could have been the bullet that killed the soldier, but that's no way to prove that, a New York state button, coat button, and two United States, what they call eagle buttons that were on the blouses of Union infantrymen. So this was just one of the graves that he did excavate that had some material in it. In other of the graves, we did find other pieces, other buttons. Sometimes we found, for instance, suspender buckles, other buttons. In fact, we found another New York button, bullets, and sometimes even a bone fragment or two. But most of the graves had been cleared out and cleaned thoroughly, so there wasn't too much left behind. Most of these graves, of course, were excavated after the Battle of Gettysburg in the months of October, November into 1864, when they were establishing the new National Cemetery. And all of these bodies were removed to the National Cemetery. But a lot of the graves were hurriedly excavated, disinterred, and they left behind relics. Most of the relics, like bone chips and bone fragments, would have been long gone. But in one, because of the soil being what it was, we did find a few pieces. Now, in other graves, he did find relics. So all through this area, there are still some of these 1863 Union graves right on the Second Corps Hospital. And I think this is very unusual and fascinating, because it's the only place of all of the 11,000 killed and mortally wounded where you can see their final resting place, except for the burial trench on Colts Hill. During and after the battle, many soldiers were buried on the Colts Hill area and in the Colts Hill area. There was evidence at one time that there were as many as 17 burial trenches in that area, dug for the Confederate dead. Some of the trenches would contain 40 men, some all the way up to 100, maybe even more. One eyewitness said he did see a trench that had over 150 in it. On the Union side, there were burial trenches, but most of the Union were buried in single graves. Now, today, because of the erosion along Rock Creek, where most of the burial trenches were initially excavated, the Rock Creek's rising and falling through the years, and the natural erosion of Colts Hill and Spangler's Ridge and other places covered these trenches up. Now, in the 1870s, 1871, 2, and 3, when they began to remove the Confederate dead, all of the trenches were opened. The dead were removed and they were left open. So they had this kind of a pitiful, sad look about them, these open trenches. Sometimes you'd see fragments of cloth or bone still left, and even now and then a relic of the battle, such as a belt buckle or a button, just laying there in these old trenches. But over the years, they lost even that ragged, rough-looking appearance, and they began to be smoothed over by time, and eventually disappeared with erosion and the elements and the leaves and that sort of thing. Today, there's only one left. I'm aware of only one honest-to-goodness burial trench that you can see the remains of, and that still remains along the ridge between Spangler Spring and Colts Hill, the very summit of Colts Hill. The National Cemetery that most people are familiar with sits on Cemetery Hill, the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Began in October of '63 and was completed in '64. But next to it is a cemetery that's really much more important. It was the Evergreen Cemetery. The association was founded in the early 1850s. By 1860, there was a nice new gatehouse sitting right on the Baltimore Pike, which is probably the most prominent and most famous building in the Gettysburg area. The gatehouse is quite lovely, and at one time was the only thing on the hill other than the small cemetery, and you could get a beautiful view of the surrounding area. During the battle, the Union soldiers, many from the 11th Corps and 1st Corps, who fell back from west and north of Gettysburg to take a new defensive position that evening of July 1st, many of the soldiers were ordered to take down the monuments in the cemetery. They were asked to lower the stones onto the ground for two reasons. One was that they would not be damaged, but the most important reason was that if a shell or a cannonball hit one of these stones and broke it, the fragments would not hurt the horses and men that were up there. So the cemetery suffered relatively little damage in the case of stones being broken by shell damage. However, there was probably a dozen or more stones that were broken up or cracked by artillery fragments and projectiles. Several of those remain today, as you can see by the pictures, and these are quite rare because either the stones damaged have been replaced or they have weathered over time or been misplaced or removed. So the ones you're looking at are quite rare. There's several of them in the cemetery. One, which is the most interesting, I think, is one that was mentioned by several eyewitnesses. And it was a sergeant named Huber, who was in a Pennsylvania regiment, who had been mortally wounded or killed in an 1862 battle around Fair Oaks, Virginia. And I suppose his body was moved by his family back to Gettysburg and buried here. And of all the really odd things about war, a shell from the Confederate lines smashed his gravestone. Prior to the time that the plans for the National Cemetery went into effect, there were many bodies from the field itself being removed to Evergreen Cemetery because families or just burial details were looking for places to inter these men. In some cases, the burials were made in Evergreen Cemetery, not realizing that there was going to be a Soldiers' National Cemetery a year later. At one point, there were probably over 100 Union soldiers buried in Evergreen Cemetery, and there's still many of them today. The reason Confederates got into it, we know of one case, for instance, where a Confederate soldier had died in the Union Second Corps Hospital. And because many of the bodies there were just in the farmer's cornfield or up on a ridge behind his house, that sort of thing, it was not a common thing, but some families did have their soldiers paid for to have removed from these field hospitals into a town cemetery. And in one case, one of the soldiers was moved from the Second Corps Hospital where he'd been buried to this Evergreen Cemetery. There was also, I'm sure, a few others just out of unusual cases how they ended up here. But the graves of those men are not known, the actual grave sites. The stones are just placed here, marking them, knowing that they were here. The Cemetery Association did mark in its books in 1864 that it had moved a couple of Confederate bodies into the cemetery, but they moved them out behind an ivy-covered rock somewhere in a distant part of the cemetery, and their graves were lost. So the stones you see today just memorialize those men that are some buried somewhere in an unknown section of Evergreen Cemetery. The National Cemetery Association, which began to collect monies and buy land and so forth, started their operations in October. A plan was devised whereas the Union soldiers would be taken up from the field, disinterred, moved by wagon, placed in coffins, and then put into this new cemetery, which contains 17 acres. The graves would be buried in a semicircle. Each grave would be a single man would be buried in each grave, and then each state would have its own plot. And in the center there would be a large monument placed to honor the dead. And as we all know or are familiar with, Edward Everett dedicated the cemetery on November 19th, 1863, and Abraham Lincoln was also part of that ceremony. What is not known by many people is that some Confederates slipped in, even though the person ultimately responsible for these reburials, Samuel Weaver, made a statement that he felt that no Confederates had gotten into the cemetery by mistake, into the Union National Cemetery. We know today from research that it's very likely that at least 3, and possibly more, could be as many as a dozen, did get into the cemetery. There was, for instance, a Mississippian, we believe, now lies in the grave of a Massachusetts soldier. In one of the unknown plots, we're almost positive that a major, which fought under General Ewell in the Confederate Army, who was killed at Colts Hill, is buried in one of the under one of the stones in the unknown plot. There's also, we believe, a Maryland soldier who fought for the Confederacy who's buried in one of the Maryland sections. What is not known for sure is how many others lie under these stones that may be Confederates that inadvertently, by accident, because of the poor identification methods they had and the lack of hard evidence as who they were, we don't know how many might still be here. But the number is probably small, and I would say it would have to be less, probably less than a dozen, but I would believe it's at least 3 or 4, maybe more.
John Blair Lynn was a barrister residing in Center County, Pennsylvania. An amateur historian, Lynn traveled to Gettysburg, arriving on the 7th of July. While there, he collected a number of relics from the battlefield and kept a journal of his visit, which survives to this day.
And it only made sense that after something as big and important as the Battle of Gettysburg, that Lynn would make a trip down here, and he did. And he arrived here almost within the week after the battle and stayed for a while. And not only did he visit almost every site and see everything from bodies that hadn't been buried yet to visiting the wounded from his area, soldiers that come from his area, but he also picked up relics and souvenirs of the battle. And some of his pieces that remain today are probably some of the earliest trophies, souvenirs or relics that were kept by visitors to the field, especially that we know for certain where they came from, who picked them up, and exactly where they came from. This is a rare occurrence. The collection remains intact. Lynn was methodical about telling where he found pieces, and he gave excellent descriptions of the way the battlefield looked in the week or so after the fighting. There are only a handful of civilian accounts of this type, and Lynn's is by far the best. And just the idea of a man exploring for a week around a field that was as bad, and as you can imagine, as bad as Gettysburg was, in itself is a very rare occurrence.
Tuesday, 7 July, 3 miles before we got into town, we could see the marks of cavalry skirmishes, past some dead horses which were slowly burning. 2 miles this side of town, we left our conveyances and walked in, took into the fields to the left of the road. Here I picked up some torn Confederate money. We kept to the south of town and soon came upon the debris of a battle, any quantity of shells lying about. Under an oak tree was a grave marked WPD, 2nd Louisiana. His little tin bucket, cartridge box coat, contents of his haversack were lying about, and near the place the shell that killed him. I took a cartridge out of his cartridge box. Further on we mounted a hill and came upon a number of dead horses. A blown-up caisson marked the position of a rebel battery. The stench of the horses was horrid. I picked a box marked 3-second fuses, Richmond Arsenal. Wednesday, 8 July. Further on passing along the parapet made of fence rail, mud and knapsacks filled with earth. On the right side of the road we came to what was once Joseph Sherfy's peach orchard. The house was terribly used up by shell. One had struck a bureau and knocked it into 1,000 fragments. The rain slacked, and we returned, picking up some letters, cards, etc. for relics. I found a testament with the name T.C. Horcraft, 34th Regiment, New York State Volunteers, Excelsior Eagle and Shield. On the next leaf was written David Mitchell, 105th Virginia Regiment. I picked up a letter from a boy to his father, evidently stained with his father's blood. Contents very interesting. It is among the relics I have from the field. John Blair Lynn.
With all of the death, destruction, carnage, and hardship suffered at Gettysburg, the beauty of the setting sun over the land seems to serve as a reminder that we shall never again spill our brother's blood. And we're reminded that once again, we're united under one flag, one country. and the flame of peace eternal burns over this most hallowed ground.